Hi, I'm Lisa Ball. I'm a Forest Service Logging System Specialist for Regions 5 and 6, and so I cover California, Oregon, and Washington. Today I'm going to go over a brief presentation of logging systems considerations in fire salvage. So if you're looking at an area to salvage log, helping you identify a lot of ways that logging systems is similar to a normal green sale, but also some of the differences that you need to deal with while operating in a fire salvage area. So most of my personal experience with fire salvage is mostly focused on hazard tree abatement along roads, mostly in Oregon. And so in order to give a broader perspective and to help cover more of the areas that people experience salvage logging and what their challenges are, I've reached out to some friends and colleagues. And so I want to give some special thank yous to Andra Saralakos from the Nez Perce tribe, Dana Kojos from Roseburg Forest Products, Matthew Temchek from the U.S. Forest Service, and Robert Rich from the U.S. Forest Service. And their experience is across actually 4 different agencies and multiple states: Idaho, Montana, Arizona, Oregon. So I'm hoping to kind of bring a range of perspectives for you, and they were greatly instrumental in helping me enrich this content of this presentation. One of the main things that basically is at the top of mind for anyone who's dealing with fire salvage really is timing, its markets, wood degradation, insects, and ultimately the value of the timber. Across all agencies, across all areas of the West, that is a primary concern, really more so than the actual logging systems themselves. Bark beetles and other insects is huge. Dana was telling me that, he has learned more about insect biology and life cycles than he ever wanted to know. In some parts of the West, blue stain out in Montana was really important to try to get the logs harvested before that would come in and degrade the value of the wood. Mill capacity or willingness to take burnt wood is another huge consideration. And there have been multiple sales that some people went through a lot of effort to lay them out, to analyze them, and then just had no one wanting to buy it anymore because the local mills were just like, no, we're done. We have enough burnt wood, and we're not taking any more. So that mill capacity and willingness to take more really is a huge consideration. And part of that might go into the checking and cracking. A lot of the electronic scans that are in the mills can't really catch that checking and cracking, and so that might be another reason why they're less willing to bring that material online. Fire severity is going to affect how fast those logs degrade. And so really, especially for the private landowners, the ability to get in and start actively logging as soon as possible really was a major driving factor for them. I think Roseburg was saying that within 3 weeks they'd already gotten their roads open, where we're starting to do active operations. Especially they were saying if the bugs hadn't flown for that year. So if the fire's earlier in the year, there's more chance bugs will get into it immediately that fall, versus if it's a later fire, you might have a year before the bugs really get into it. There was some considerations for, especially with the soils, of maybe waiting until those soils had settled. And that's waiting either for a first real good rain or snow or ice pack in order to protect those soils, especially if it burnt really hot and deep on organic soils. But in general, there's very little difference in the layout perspective between a green sail and a salvage sail. You know, slopes less than 30 to 40% are going to be ground-based. Those slopes over that are probably going to be cable yarded. Occasionally, if you have a situation that warrants it, you might have some helicopter come in. And people are going to use the roads that, you know, honestly, those that they were able to open and get to. As far as logging systems goes, you know, conventional ground-based logging was and is probably the most common method of salvage logging that's out there, which, you know, shouldn't be a surprise because it is the most cost-effective method out there. And so when your value of your material is reduced due to fires, you obviously are going to have less capacity to take on more expensive systems. And for conventional here, I'm talking about feller bunchers, skidders, either tracked or rubber tired, and then a processor at the landing. There was some debate among the skidders whether a rubber tired skidder was acceptable or where they wanted a tracked skidder. A lot of rubber tired skidders are being used in these fire areas. However, Dana with Roseburg was saying that they do not do that because in their experience, the rubber tired skidders were making a mess. But a lot of that's going to depend on both the soils you have originally and, of course, burn severity. So when we talk cut-to-length systems, it differs from the conventional system that we saw in that instead of having the feller buncher, which is just cutting the trees, here we have the harvester that's going to cut the trees, take all the limbs and tops off, and a forwarder instead of a skidder. And the Nez Perce was the only agency that I was talking to that really have it as a significant part of their normal green tree program, in part because it is a little bit more of an expensive system in general. But they have moved away from this method in their post-fire treatment. And the reason that they've moved away from it is because they've tried it for several years, but the benefit you get from a traditional cut to length is reduced soil impacts because those machines are operating on the slash. But if there's not enough slash, that benefit is gone. And a cut to length system requires significantly more machine trails than the conventional system. And so what they have found is that they get all of the increased trails, but they don't have that slash component to help protect the soil. So they get the same effects on the conventional ground-based system, but if they do the cut to length, then it's over a significantly bigger footprint. So tethered logging is where we're taking a piece of traditional ground-based equipment and we're tying a cable onto the back of it that's connected farther up the hill, and tension is being put into that line, and it's assisting that piece of equipment as it goes up and down the hill. And as it does that, it reduces the soil impacts and allows that machine to operate on significantly steeper slopes than you would normally see ground-based equipment. It's catching on a lot in private industry, even some state lands. Forest Service we're getting into it slowly. But there was some mixed results from the people I talked with on the use of tethered logging. So in Idaho, they had experience where the soils were burned so hot and so deep that the machines were unable to get any tractive effort, even when working with highly experienced tethered operators. But someone I talked to in Western Oregon who actually had been skeptical about tethering but decided to give it a try, was using it on a feller buncher and felt that it worked really well, better than expected. And so they're planning to make that a more common tool in the toolbox for going onto these steep slopes and at least felling the trees and setting it up to be yarded. So I think it's going to depend a lot on the soils that you have, and especially maybe how deep that organic layer was, how deep you have to go before you hit rock, on if it's a situation that would work well for you or not. So for the ground-based systems, the main considerations that you need to think about really are: what soils did you start with, how hot did they burn, and what do you have now? Did you start with nice deep organic soils that burnt hot and now you have 2, 3, maybe even 4 feet of moon dust? Or did you have thin layers and now you have rock? And all of that is a consideration for your ground-based, and it's still a consideration when we move into cable yarding. But with cable yarding, we have additional factors that we have to consider, not only for the production and wanting to maintain the soils as well as we can, but also from a safety perspective. When you're cable yarding, if you're doing any type of skyline, you're going to need tail holds, and ideally you might want intermediate supports and tail trees. And for a traditional yarder, you're going to need guidelines to help hold that yarder up during operations. And so, it doesn't take much fire in order to really weaken the holding capacity of the roots and the trees. And the first thing that you're going to lose is the ability to do those intermediate supports and those tail trees, because the tensions on the line are pulling on the tree 30, 40 feet up in the air. If you have a weakened root structure, it just can't hold. But it can be a concern even down at the stump if the roots are burnt or if the soil has been weakened so much that there's just no holding capacity there anymore. And so you have to look at alternatives of, if I don't have these stump anchors, which is the ideal situation, what other options are there? So one of the alternatives to stumps is to actually use machines as anchors instead. And that is a common choice. Sometimes it's used down at the bottom of the unit as, instead of a tail hold that's an anchor, bring in a piece of machinery. That is, of course, assuming that you can get the machine down to where the anchor needs to be. You can also use anchors as guy lines for that tower. But depending on that tower, you might need several anchors, and you could start running out of machines to act as anchors. And so that is where you also might want to look at bringing in other pieces of machinery other than a traditional tower. So if you look at an excaliner, which is here, it's definitely more common in Idaho, Montana, Rocky Mountain area, but you can use an excaliner. It does not have any guy line requirements. So as long as you have a tail hold, whether that is a stump or you bring in a machine as the tail hold, that's a good option. If you're in Oregon, Washington, you're probably more likely to see a yoder. Different piece of machinery, but similar in that it doesn't have any guy lines, and you just need a tail hold at the end. The excliners do tend to have a little bit higher capacity than the yoders, and if you're trying to salvage log larger material, it just might be beyond the capabilities of these machines, especially the yoder. But it might be something that's all you can get in because there are no good anchors available. You might also have the ability to bring in a tong thrower where you don't have any anchors at all, not even a tail hold, and you're just using the machine to throw tongs down into the unit where you have a tong setter who will choke the logs so that they can come up. And also shovel logging, which can't be used on the steepest of slopes, but it is an option on those moderately steep slopes where you're basically just kind of picking the machines up and moving it closer to the landing slowly. Helicopter logging of kind of fire burned areas is really uncommon because it's very expensive method of logging, and usually the trees don't have that much value. Although I have seen it used mostly in hazard tree abatement. This situation here, it was getting the logs off of a cliff that was up above a highway. And Andrew was saying that sometimes they've brought it in, but it can be a problem because especially if the soil's burnt a lot and it's really ashy and dusty, the rotowash from the helicopter will blow all that ash up into the air. The pilot can't see the people on the ground, and it slows production down, and it's a bit of a safety hazard, as you can imagine, and it takes an expensive system and makes it even more expensive. So again, it's not very common. So I've talked a bit about burn intensity several times now, and I just want to kind of reiterate again that burn intensity is really important, because the hotter the burn, the more damage to the soil, the slower your production's going to be, the worse your soil's impact is going to be, the worse value you're going to get from your trees because they're more damaged. And if you're into those lighter burn areas, then you can get better production, you'll have better value from your timber. And so it really is economically advantageous to go after those more lighter burn areas. But also, while still fighting the fire, Andrew on the Nez Perce was talking about how they really like to do back burns as fire lines because the back burn area burns so much differently than the main wildfire as it's going through. And that because that burn intensity is less, then they have more options and they can then get higher value from that back burn area and help the costs and the production from that to offset the costs of that high burn area that they're going to try to go after. So I wanted to end today talking about safety and things to consider and think about while doing salvage operations. The first one is there is an increase in safety concerns in these areas. Mainly you have hazard trees all around where you're putting people who are working, especially if they are not in a protected cab. They're at increased risk, especially your fallers, of course. There's also risks of maybe less serious injuries, but more common would be those slips, trips, falls. You have burnt out root areas. People step in them, twist an ankle, hyperextend a knee. And so that is something to be cognizant about while operating in these areas. And also that there can be a significant increase in truck traffic over even a normal high volume situation, because you might have multiple sides going at once, especially if you're concerned about getting the wood out in a timely manner before it degrades. And so just having a good plan to communicate with the truckers on how to maintain safe operations and not, run into each other or run each other off the road. And so all of those safety considerations should be thought about and, communicated with the people who are out there doing the work. So I hope I gave you a few things to think about if you're contemplating doing some fire salvage. A lot of it's very similar to conventional systems. You're obviously going to use the systems that are available in your area, but the value is going to be reduced and the costs are going to be higher. And there are some extra considerations to consider, including what the operations will do to the soils, and particularly if you're doing any type of cable yarding, if you have those anchors available, and if not, what you can do in order to get anchors to remove that material safely. Have a great day. Goodbye.